Great, thanks very much. Always difficult to go after a panel from Jamie because he manages it so well. But I'd just like to reflect what Jamie said about Jim Lawrence. Sadly missed, and our thoughts are with his loved ones and his families as well. So, welcome to the panel. Welcome to the panel. I think some good discussions here today. So we know that the IMO MEPC committee held its second extraordinary session last October. And I guess it's like the news today. When you put the news on in the morning, you just don't know what to expect. And I think that was the general consensus as we built up to that session. You know, the focus was on adopting amendments for the IMO net zero framework for shipping. While the framework was agreed in principle, member states were not able to reach consensus on the detailed mechanics, particularly around the global fuel standard and the emissions pricing mechanism as well. I was sitting outside on the second to last day, outside the plenary area. Bureau Veritas were sponsoring the drinks reception. Fascinating to watch the body language of all the government representatives coming out on the mobile phones, some very tense looks and some very tense discussions, and quite aggressive discussions. So that was really interesting to watch that unfold, and that was the second to last day. You know, you, Roel, and the Secretary General, you remain positive. So hats off to the IMO for remaining positive there. So as we know, as a result, the session ended without adopting the draft amendments, and the majority have voted to reconvene in 2026 with work on guidelines continuing through international session meetings. So it's going to be very interesting as we go through this year to see what developments. But before we go into the discussion, I'd like to take a quick sense check for you in the audience, in the room. By show of hands, who thinks the decision to pause for 12 months was a good one?
There's one there.
I can see one. Two. Okay, who thought then it was not a good decision? Wow. Okay, thank you. That sort of gives us a good starting point, right? Great. So let's go into the discussion now for Roel. Okay, what is the schedule in terms of IMO meetings for 2026? Can you elaborate a bit what the ongoing work streams and the pathway to the next meeting in October? Probably puts you in the limelight a bit, but please share as much as you can.
Thank you, David. There are two main meetings planned for 2026. One taking place the end of April, and another negotiation round of the Marine Environment Protection Committee, the MEPC, in November. And these two meetings will provide the next kind of spaces for our membership, the 176 member states of the IMO, to reconvene and continue their discussions, their negotiations on the next rule set of global measures driving energy efficiency and reduction of greenhouse gases. As you said, I think we remain positive. We know that discussions are happening as we speak. These discussions obviously do not only take place in the meetings, but are taking place now. What we see is that there's a continued commitment to work towards global regulations, driving energy efficiency. But I think last meeting, the October session, was also an important learning point for many delegations, including those that were heavily involved in drafting text on what can work and what cannot work in terms of global regulations for the shipping industry. And so I think what we're looking at now, what we hear member states discussing is how can global regulations drive energy efficiency, reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, but really correspond with the reality of shipping, are easy to implement, can drive energy innovation, but do not over-penalize the existing ship and the existing fleet. So I think these are the ingredients that we're now, or that member states are looking into together in order to make the best use of this additional year to find a framework that can work and that can adopt it by consensus. Now, in the meanwhile, whilst the negotiations on the regulations are unfolding, work is happening, particularly on providing more certainty on the implementing provisions. Think about fuel certification. So how can we more easily bring in all the alternative fuels and the certification frameworks that exist into IMO regulations. Regulations on carbon intensity, so further driving energy efficiency, onboard carbon capture and storage systems, so how can we also continue to drive clean technologies, and putting all these ingredients together to provide more certainty for the member states, for the governments and for the industry, whilst the regulations and the key reduction requirements are being negotiated.
Okay, great, thanks Roel. You've got your work cut out over the next few months on the whole of the IMO. You know, and I would say please stay positive and keep that force going, because it really helps for sure. Michael. Hi. Good to see you as ever. Absolutely sure. So, Michael, does the delay in adoption of the IMO NZF change banks' views on the ultimate goal? You know, does it affect the capital deployment for the coming 12 months, or if not longer? And how are the banks going to get there? How are we going to get there?
The answer is no, I don't think so, because I think whilst the expectation had been that what had been agreed in principle would be followed through, as Roel has just said, there is a long process. I remember when we launched the Poseidon Principles back in 2019, and we had to have the DCS regulation in 18 to be able to do something meaningful. I remember feeling very frustrated that everything would take 5 years before there was, any sort of change. And I think what we've sort of seen is the enthusiasm and to some extent idealism that people say peaked at the Glasgow COP in COP26 sort of has come off, and one shouldn't really be over-influenced by the current US administration's view on these things, because although the president has a view on the science, most other people think he's wrong, and the reality is that the industry knows that it's going to have to adapt to this change and changes in regulation. So as we saw in our Poseidon Principles results for last year, that actually the efficiency of the fleet is improving, and it's because ship owners want to do things and are going to do things. So I think finance will continue to focus on obviously making the right return on capital, and you'll hear from the banking panel after lunch how they think they'll do that. But because I think shipping increasingly is going to be driven through cargo interests as much as regulation, I haven't really seen any change in the view of, most, particularly in the container sector, most of the big consumer companies, that they need to have more efficient, cleaner supply chains. So I don't think the setback is anything other than a temporary and maybe good change in the likely regulations that will still make 2050 a challenge. But I think none of the institutions that in effect resigned from the Net Zero Banking Alliance have changed their own individual commitments to net zero in 2050. So I think that fundamental thing is there. What I do think is important, and the Poseidon Principles is about transparency, not about setting targets. The Net Zero Banking Alliance was about targets, which is what was objected to by a number of people, including the Trump administration. That transparency is what is important, so we can measure the progress that we're making. And the great thing about the IMO and the DCS regulation is that the emissions from the world fleet, the data is there. We get it as banks privately because we ask for it and we get given it. But the reality is the IMO, and I know the Secretary General has said publicly that he's in favour of it, but countries in the IMO should not be afraid to vote for that transparency so we can all see the improvements being obtained. And I think, finance doesn't want to get involved in, the public slanging matches on this issue, but will continue to, I think, motivate the investments that will reduce emissions, because that is the only way in which finance, whether it is banks, whether it is investors, want to be investing in the right things, not just from a sort of moral perspective, but also the things that actually will make the better returns, because in the long run, the cargo owners are going to put their cargoes on the ships that have the lowest emissions, because that's what their own customers want them to do.
Yeah, no, for sure, for sure. I think you're absolutely right. The transparency, I think you need to be applauded about driving the Poseidon principles. I think we've got a lot to thank you for that, Michael. Yeah, absolutely, transparency is going to be key. Absolutely sure. So let's turn to the EU ETS and the Fuel EU. A little chat about that for Rachel, please. Rachel, the EU ETS and the Fuel EU are acting as drivers for change. What do you see benefiting commercially, or who do you see benefiting commercially from these regimes? And any other commercial opportunities in the voluntary carbon markets, i.e. in setting? Love your views on that, please.
Well, very happy to share them, thank you. Well, while we're in the era of the big pause, as it was termed earlier, as a lawyer and specifically as a maritime decarbonisation lawyer, I'm of course very interested in the regulation which is in existence today. And EU ETS and Fuel EU are driving change. Fuel EU, the whole thrust there is energy transition, and we're seeing that it is driving an increased uptake in biofuels. Interestingly, that's not only to comply with the regulation, it's actually to go beyond compliance and to be in a compliance plus scenario. Now, why is that interesting? It's interesting because or why is it attractive rather? It's attractive because the regulation itself provides flexibility mechanisms for compliance. You can comply by banking, borrowing, or pooling your compliance balance. So if you have a positive compliance balance, what you effectively have is a new commodity that you can trade and that you can generate a new revenue stream on. If, for instance, you operate on LNG and you have the right engine and you're managing methane slip appropriately, you are in a compliance positive situation through till 2029. So there's a new opportunity to make money in connection with this. Who is making that money? Well, if you are supplying a fuel which is going to be compliant or put a vessel in a position of over-compliance, there's an opportunity. And if you're operating a vessel which can then convert that into a compliance balance that can be traded. Now, at the moment, I would say there's potential there, and this comes down to how is pooling done. So there are regulatory parameters on pooling, but the trading of the compliance surplus aspect, that's pure private contract. We as lawyers are reviewing the contracts by which compliance surplus is being bought and sold regularly. And what I can say is that this is an entirely new market. There is no standardization in that market yet. The contracts are very new, the issues are new, there are new risks, and there are new liabilities. And pooling is complex because it relies on predictions as to compliance outcomes, it relies on data exchange, and if you're doing that beyond your own fleet, it also relies on the coordinated action of a number of parties who are fragmented in a time-sensitive scenario. So we can see there are lots of parties who I am sure will benefit through pooling, through the sale of compliance surplus. Not to be overlooked is the possibility that things won't go perfectly to plan and that some parties who anticipated they would benefit will potentially end up paying out compensation at a Fuel EU penalty rate if pooling doesn't go smoothly. And we're not yet at the point in the regulatory compliance cycle where we will know how all of that has come out in the wash. So it's a bit of a wait and see to some extent. That's all in the regulatory realm. You mentioned the voluntary carbon market. If you're outside of EU trade, there are opportunities to do something similar in the voluntary carbon market, which is to monetize your emissions reductions through insetting. We've been instructed to prepare the contractual architecture of insetting schemes for 2 major ship owners, work we've done in recent years. And interestingly, and this comes to Michael's point about end user demand, the voluntary carbon market exists because end users care about the green credentials of their products. I was catching up with one of those clients recently. Their clients care very much, and he told me that their sustainability department is currently outperforming their freight department financially. So I think that's a real testament to the opportunity that exists there. Something that I'll flag, just coming back to Roel and the IMO, is that those opportunities may not last forever. Because in the event that there is a global fuel intensity standard, then the pooling opportunity under Fuel EU and the voluntary carbon market opportunity may not exist any longer. So they're there. They may not be there forever.
A whole new world of different complex challenges for us, that's for sure. As you say, let's see how it goes. And it's a whole new world that we're facing, and we're seeing that every day, aren't we? Not just in our industry, but globally, and the geopolitics as well. So, Vincent, from your perspective, how do you see things playing out in the market right now with the current regulations? And what can we expect in the coming years?
Yeah, thanks a lot for that question. I think, questions, I should say. It has multiple dimensions to what we see playing out in the market, but also what we can see for the future and how a ship owner could set up properly to do so. If I start with what we see in the market today, actually, according to DNV's latest numbers, there's 846 dual-fuel LNG vessels in operation, and there's a strong order book with another 642 vessels. Looking at the demand side, Rystad Energy published that marine LNG bunkering fuels in 2025 amounted to 4 million tonnes, so it's getting significant. And as we just heard, we also see an increase in bio-LNG demand, which is driven by regulations due to the fact that you can use it for Fuel EU maritime pooling and sell it on to another ship owner via a pooling arrangement. What we also see is that progress cannot wait for regulatory clarity. The postponement of the IMO net zero framework has caused uncertainty. However, reality is that the shipping industry can't really pause decarbonization, because any ship that's being ordered today will operate into the 2050s. So that means your investment decision today will actually shape emission profiles, but also your competitiveness for decades to come. And then waiting for full regulatory clarity might increase compliance cost, but it can also lead to potential loss of market position or the need for an expensive retrofit later on. If we look at what you can do, and we look at the methane pathway, we see LNG, bio-LNG, and later on synthetic LNG providing a pragmatic solution that can reduce emissions today, but also allows for a lot of flexibility as regulations and technology evolve into the future. So if you have an LNG dual-fuel vessel today and you burn conventional LNG, that means you can save up to 23% of GHG emissions, depending on the engine type, on a well-to-wake basis, including methane slip. As supply scales up and you can start blending in bio-LNG and synthetic LNG in increased quantities, you can do that seamlessly because you don't need any engine modifications as it's all methane-based. So it allows for a very good transition. If we look at current infrastructure and bunkering capabilities, actually LNG is most advanced versus other alternative fuels. And according to CLNG, this continues to grow quite rapidly, with LNG being available for marine bunkering over 200 ports. Now, lastly, if we look at the commercial realities, but also the patchwork of regulatory framework, there's an advantage actually to move and to do something early, rather than just wait and see. And I think that's very much to your point on Fuel EU Maritime and EU ETS actually already have an impact. There's different views maybe on the calculation on until when LNG is eligible under Fuel EU Maritime, but it's eligible for a number of years to come. And under EU ETS, all emission savings will generate sort of direct savings compared to burning fuel oil just on a carbon intensity basis. So if I were to very quickly summarize, we cannot wait for regulatory clarity because actually decisions today will shape future competitiveness. LNG and bio-LNG is available at scale today and are advantaged under the current operational regulatory framework. And lastly, there's a commercial advantage to move early and set yourself up for flexibility.
No, that's great. I mean, it's a big decision for an owner if they're going to go and place an order now for those assets that are going to be still around, you know, when we get to 2050. It's a huge decision. Certainly from our aspect, we're seeing an array of different alternatives being ordered. And a lot of the ship owners just not putting all their eggs in one basket, that's for sure. And I think that will actually continue. But I think your message there is LNG will still take a major part as we go through to 2050, right?
LNG, or at least the methane pathway,
yeah.
will take a major part because LNG, bio-LNG, synthetic LNG, they're all the same fuel. So you can use the same engine, same infrastructure, and really have a pathway towards net zero on the back of that.
Yeah, no, great. At least there's one pathway, right? So that's good. Brilliant. Thank you, Vincent. For Marie, how have you been looking at ways to assess the various risks, specifically standard asset risk in a number of policies and energy transition scenarios? I know that you've been working on lots of different scenarios. Can you just talk us around that, please?
Yeah, thank you. So traditionally, in our team, we would look at this from a top-down perspective. So you take a a climate target, let's say IMO 2023 strategy or 1.5. You take this target and you compare how the current fleet compares to that target. And in general, our results show that the fleet is not aligned in that target, meaning to quote you a bit, in 2050 or 2040, a lot of the ships which are built today will be there, and they're not in line with this target. And that means that if we do the transition, it's going to be more expensive because, you need to either go to more expensive fuel pathways or retrofit or scrap early the ships. We have now two new ways of looking at this topic. The first one is more granular, and it comes a bit from what happened at the IMO, which was, quite a shock. But from an intellectual perspective, it's quite interesting what happened, because you move from a place where you had a fairly clear pathway, let's say IMO net zero framework, and now the range of plausible scenarios is much bigger, right? At the one extreme, you have something which looks like IMO falls through and maybe some regional regulation, maybe not, so something, quite extreme. At the other end, you might have something which looks like the IMO 2023 strategy, so more ambitious than the net zero framework, So the range of plausible scenarios has increased, and that comes on top of a range of uncertainties which were already there, so on fuel prices, emission factors, technology availability, etc. So instead of looking now at one top-down objective, we built a set of consistent scenarios, taking all those extremes into account. Currently, we're at 600, just to give you an idea of it. And then we look at specific ships. How resilient are they to those scenarios? On average, do they perform better or worse than the others? And how do they perform in the worst case scenarios? How badly can you fall, essentially? And that depends on the optionality which ships have built in. So a dual fuel ship, typically, for example, LNG, would have an optionality to switch fuels, as you described, but obviously you already have a capital invested at new build, whereas a conventional ship has the option to retrofit later on. So they have different types of optionality and different types of risk profile. That's how we look at it. And generally, our results, they're very preliminary for now, but they're going to come out in the coming month or so. Our results suggest that in the current regulatory environment, there is a strong incentive for wait and see and keep the option to retrofit in the future open, which means that, so this is both linked to the fact that the IMO net zero framework has been adjourned, hasn't been adopted. It's also linked to the fact that the net zero framework is not in line with the 2023 strategy in 2030. So it's not, we're not at the level of ambition. So that suggests that we do need a policy, push to do a mass market transition. And finally, the final, the last piece of work we are working on at the moment is to try to see, in the event of a devaluation of a ship, on a mass devaluation. Like I'm thinking of like mid-2030s, strong push in regulation, and then the ship profitability of certain ships switches quite widely to one another. Who pays the price? How does that trickle down between the owners and the banks and the different types of investors? That's still ongoing work, but we find that generally banks are pretty protected at an individual loan, let's say, level for an individual transaction because of like the seniority of the transaction, the fact that the loan to values are pretty low, the tenors are fairly short. But as the industry creates this systemic risk, right, we continue ordering new, ships which are not in line with a certain trajectory, then we might come up with a situation with refinancing risk if all the banks together start to face those risks. But at an individual transaction, we don't see a very strong risk.
No, interesting, thank you. The wait and see strategy. Do you think that's the wait and see strategy that you said from a number of owners? You know, do you see more owners going to remain there, or will you see more owners as technology comes along and the regulations become more clear, they'll start to accelerate the compliance?
Is that the question for me?
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. I think for now, I think for the mass market, like generally, I think wait and see seems to be like a rational decision to make, let's say. I think as the political landscape clarifies, maybe it becomes slightly less like interesting. I think there is a strategy, but it's maybe more for some early movers to get a heads up, like in case and betting on essentially in my classification of scenarios on the higher ambition scenarios, like to get a head start in some types of technologies to be able to gain some profitability and market share when that happens. But yeah, for a mass transition point of view, I think it's like, yeah, makes more sense.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, no, it's great. Thank you. We talked about regulations. I think all of you talked about regulations, so we can just go around the panel, starting off with Michael first. Are the current regulations adequate or a hindrance?
I don't think they're a hindrance. I think, and they're clearly inadequate in some respects if you compare shipping to aviation, for example. And that is not just issues, technical issues. If you look at the governance issues around shipping, the whole way the industry works, you know, that is a huge topic, the whole issue, outside of the IMO's responsibility. You know, that's a big topic around, you know, whether global trade, the UNCLOS treaty and all the other things, does that need changing? So you could argue that, you know, shipping has existed in a post-Second World War environment where things worked pretty well, but we've seen clearly, you know, the stresses on the seafarers and the environment. These are issues which were not really factored into regulation sort of in the post-war period. So it needs updating. So I think it's not a hindrance, but it's inadequate. And the question is going to be, who does regulate that? And that's why really the issue in October last year was not about some of the complaints about lack of impact assessment on certain fuels. That was a legitimate complaint by parts of the industry. It was entirely a political decision to obstruct an international body pursuing its job. Now that's, to me, the issue in October or November, as Roel said, whenever that comes around, as to whether the IMO will be allowed to do its job politically by the member states. And I think if it is, that a lot will flow from that. The risk, as everyone said, around the lack of the net zero framework is what replaces it. And, you know, you get a Tower of Babel of regulations from lots of different countries and regions, which will actually make life for ship owners very difficult. It'll make it inflationary for the end consumer. Okay. So I think it's not a hindrance, but it's not adequate to deal with the 21st century issues.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Michael. Rachel, your thoughts on the same question. Current regulations adequate or hindrance?
Well, I think my concern revolves around what is done to address some of the inadequacies that Michael's pointed out there, and where we go from here in terms of, in a big pause era, the proliferation of regulation at a regional level. Even in the UK, the government has decided that it will extend the UK emissions trading scheme to emissions from maritime with effect from the 1st of July this year. So that means that there are now multiple emissions trading schemes that ship owners will be trying to comply with, and there are other regions globally that are looking at doing the same. It starts to become a landscape of trip hazards, in my opinion, and the same but different scenario from a regulatory point of view is problematic. It's difficult to comply with, or rather, compliance can be complicated because of those trip hazards, those things that are similar but a bit different. I've been closely involved in the consultations with government in the UK for the last 3 years around the extension to maritime, and one of the points that I've strongly made throughout that process is to say there is already the EU ETS for maritime. It's in the interests of industry, and I think it's actually in the interests of the regulator to have as little difference as possible between those schemes. Yeah. Because the purpose of that regulation is not to deploy resources to enforce against organisations who accidentally fail to comply. The purpose is to drive the market in such a way that there will be emissions reductions. So my concern is, where do we go from here in terms of what happens at a national level, whilst there isn't yet international consensus?
No, some comments. Great. Roel, your comments on the question.
It's a difficult one. I think we'll continue work on global regulations. We see a continued strong commitment of member states as well as industry to develop a pragmatic global rule set. But I think some of the points that both Michael and Rachel mentioned are very important in those discussions and in the negotiations, and that is what can work at a national level in a country like the UK or in a region like the EU that has a very comprehensive existing emission trading scheme already in place for many years may not be something that works at the global level. At the same time, we do want to avoid duplication, a myriad of different rules that apply in different ways that imply a huge amount of double reporting or slightly different reporting. So I think the year that we have now at our disposal is actually helpful in addressing some of these elements. Also, I think picking up what Vincent said about the methane pathway, it's very important, and we know that current LNG, fossil LNG, can be replaced and is being replaced, increasingly so, partly driven by Fuel EU Maritime, by biomethane. Yep. So how can we, in the IMO framework, include elements of well-to-wake emission factors for the different LNG pathways that are realistic and that represent the global production of these alternative fuels. So we'll continue work on that. We'll provide more certainty as we go in the year ahead, including on some of the underlying implementing regulations. Think about wind-assisted propulsion. There's quite a lot of work happening on how we can bring that into the regulatory framework, so those owners that have invested in wind-assisted propulsion are being rewarded. The same applies for onboard carbon capture, and by that way make this year concrete in terms of outcomes whilst the negotiations on the global regulations unfold.
Great, thank you. Vincent, we're coming towards the end of the panel now, but I've got time just for a comment from Vincent and from Marie as well. Some quick comments, Vincent, please.
Yeah, I think so. An adequate or a hindrance. I mean, it definitely helps a bit, but I guess the unclarity also provides long-term investors with a difficult decision to make. Yeah. And well, an action or wait and see is a pathway. I think at Shell we believe that looking for a practical option today that already reduces emissions, but also it gives a lot of flexibility for the future, really is the way to set you up for success.
Great, thank you. Finally, Marie.
Yeah, no, our analysis suggests that the most effective and cost-effective way to do the low-carbon transition is a global regulation. So that's definitely plan A, if possible. But in terms of a fragmented regional regulation regime, yeah, I can see how that's complicated and trip-prone. Maybe it's helpful to help some early movers develop some niche activity. So in our transition thinking, like a niche is a protected area, like a protected market where you can try new technologies and like see them fail, make them better, reduce the cost, etc. And maybe regional regulation could be a way to like develop those niches before we can actually make a mass market transition.
Great, thank you, thank you. Well, thank you to the panel. We've come to the end of our session now. Thank you for your inputs, really appreciate it. And I think we can all say that, you know, one of the panels mentioned earlier, we as an industry are very resilient, for absolute sure. Absolutely sure. You know, and we've got challenges ahead, and we've all touched on those challenges ahead. You know, we've talked about transparency. We need the transparency, and for sure we need collaboration. So, panel, thank you for your inputs. Thank you.